morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Young. I'm the chair of the Regulatory Committee and also serving as foreign investment ombudsman in Korea to take care of the grievances for foreign investing companies in Korea. Well, I'm really delighted to moderate this session under the theme of how can market economy embrace rising demand for welfare state. I'm so pleased to introduce our truly distinguished panelists. To my left, Mr. NKC, Member of Parliament of India, and also former Finance Secretary.
No, Korea made that.
And also to the extreme left, Mr. Michael Helvet, Chief Operating Officer and Head of the Regulatory Officer, Standard Chartered Bank in Korea. Mr. Helvet is basically from Germany, right?
Yes.
So I think he can share a lot of experience.
Not extreme that way.
Yeah. All right, to my right, Dr. Wanya Lin, who is now Director, Office of Development Research, KDI, Center for International Development. KDI is, as you know, the leading think tank in Korea. And Dr. Lin has been one of the most prominent scholars in Korea in terms of this development policy issues. And to my extreme right, you can see one of the positions on the right on the left, the policy. Mr. Mr. Song Hong, Senior Fellow, Director of Research Section of International Trade, Institute of the World Economy, and Chinese Academy of Social Science. Well, welcome to this panel. Well, let me lay out some of the key issues we are going to address in this session as moderator of this session. But as we know well, how to design a better state within the capitalism has been one of the long-standing challenging issues, not only in advanced economies, but also in emerging and developing economies. In recent years, we saw across nations in the world far-reaching negative consequences of the income polarization, jobless growth, and lack of welfare measures, including social safety net, thus inviting the notion of capitalism version 4.0. As a result, the search for a viable welfare state in a market economic system has received renewed or priority attention by many developed countries and developing ones. It is very well known that many of the advanced Western capitalist states and Nordic countries, such as Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, have experimented a variety of the welfare policies in their own rights. However, a number of developing and emerging economies in the world have not really experimented a different mode of welfare state in a full scale within market economic system. For example, Korea, despite its rapid economic development, has not seriously addressed everybody in Korea was almost on equal footing in terms of people. Everybody was so poor, we just could not differentiate each other, the different income levels of the society members. However, after experiencing a financial democracy and shocks twice, we experienced in 1997, 1998 during the Asian financial crisis, and the recent global financial meltdown in 2008 since the roughly collapse of the Lehman Brothers. Korea now started to show a symptoms of jobless growth, shrinking middle income class, resulting in rather acute income polarization. And we also see a deficiency of a fundamental social safety net designed even for poorest segment of the people. Against this backdrop, Korea needs to bring in more broad-based social welfare policies and programs for rapidly aging population and very enlarged low-income bracket people. With Korea's presidential election just 6 months away now, we are supposed to take the election on December 17th. Political parties in Korea now put forward competitively a variety of welfare programs under different welfare paradigms. Indeed, now I believe Korea is at crossroads in designing a robust welfare state within capitalism at the per capita income level roughly $24,000. I think many factors need to be considered: the growth and equity is trade-off or complementary at upper middle per capita income like Korea. Maybe another issue we might address: welfare expenditure and fiscal sustainability. How they can be optimized and how we can design tax structure, especially in particular for Korea. The welfare can be designed while maintaining incentive to work. Excessive welfare programs might discourage the incentive to work. Provision of social safety net or healthcare services, for example, are truly necessary for those who need. The key question is that how we can design effective delivery system. Social experiences from Nordic and Western European countries might shed some light on this issue. And to what extent unemployment compensation, other devices could be introduced to fuller scale in Korean context. So, given this background, the first question I would like to ask each the panelists might share with us. All right, what are the major evolutionary features of welfare paradigms in Western developed economies and Nordic countries? What lessons can we draw from for developing and emerging economies which wish to bring in a welfare policies in a larger scale rather than a broad-based welfare programs and designing policies, in particular for Korea, which is just been crossroad for a welfare state while maintaining robust capitalist system. All right, so given this background, I want to ask one panelist to my left and then I will one panelist right. Okay, first to my left. Okay, since you're from Germany,
first of all, I think Korea is in a very unique position in terms of its fiscal strength. As you know, Korea has today a public debt to GDP ratio of around 33%, which is a very enviable number. I think very unique in the world. So Korea needs to make careful choices as to how it wants to prioritize the further expansion of social welfare, so as not to waste the precious resource of fiscal resources, and to carefully utilize the fiscal resources that it has. Now, I think if we look at Europe, I think Europe, Western Europe in particular, and the Nordic countries have, over the last 4 decades, built up a very vast and universal welfare system. But I think as we are all experiencing today, the continent's famed social model today is being questioned, and it might even be doomed to fail. And I think the European sovereign debt crisis has come as a kind of rude wake-up call, and seriously questioning the financial sustainability of the social welfare systems that we have put into place in the last 4 decades or 5 decades. And if you look at there's no one single formula that European countries have adopted. If you look around Europe, you will find that there is a diversity of different experiences across Europe. They have been experimenting with different systems. However, what they all have in common is the public provision of very substantial proportions of healthcare, education, pensions, and a range of social services. And all countries have also in common that they have rather inflexible labor laws, some countries more inflexible than others. Now, I think if we look at the diversity of experiences across Europe, it is quite puzzling. For instance, Spain has currently half of its youth unemployed, but 10 years ago, before the crisis, it had the most impressive record of job creation. Germany, on the other hand, was struggling seriously to create jobs in the 15 years that followed reunification. As you may recall, we had very high unemployment, particularly in eastern Germany, but also, if you take the whole country, very high unemployment ratio, and Germany was struggling at how to bring that down. Interestingly, today, Germany has come through the crisis and has seen unemployment levels falling to levels that it hasn't seen since the 1970s. And it was the German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who interestingly started his political career as a what we call young socialist. He was the leader, was leading a movement of young socialists, so he was quite left-wing type of person, but he eventually, when he was governing, became more of a center-left social democrat, and obviously has gained a lot of wisdom over the years. He used to be credited with having transformed the tri-party agreement between labor, between industry and government, and in introducing what I would call a quite revolutionary change in the previously rather rigid labor environment, which everybody thought was almost impossible to achieve. So it was in 2003 that he publicly announced that Germany can't go on doing as it is and spending as it is, and he announced that we would have to be cutting benefits. That is not something very popular to say as a leader of the state. And I thought that was quite brave of him to do so. He called it the Agenda 2010, and he introduced a welfare reform in which unemployment benefits were limited to 12 months, and then after that there would only be a very bare minimum of social payment being paid to individuals. And he looked for ways how to help unemployed, how to get training, so the Federal Employment Agency would have counseling and training them and finding them jobs to get into. And he also had big successes in dealing with impossible to go shopping in the evening in Germany because the union movement would insist that shops have to close at 6 o'clock. Now everybody works until 6 o'clock, so there was no way that anybody could go out and consume. Today, if you go to Germany, you'll find that shopping hours are much more flexibilized. You can go shopping on Saturday afternoons, which used to be impossible in Germany. Not on Sundays though, because we have a very strong Protestant movement in Germany, so opening shops on Sundays is taboo. But he did achieve a lot of flexibilization of the labor market. I think that's very important because one of the root causes that we see everywhere in terms of structural deficiencies is the lack of flexibility in labor markets. I'm mentioning it because Korea is also a place where we have lack of flexibility in the labor market, and I think that is hindering growth, and I think that's something that needs to change. Now, interestingly, the lesson learned from Mr. Schröder's reforms is that he did very well for the country, but he didn't do so well for himself because at the next elections he was not re-elected. So maybe some of his reforms were not very popular. I'm mentioning this because obviously politicians, particularly in election year, like to promise the world to everybody, and making unpopular decisions is not something that many politicians are brave enough to do. Now, another paradoxum is that the Northern European countries, or Scandinavian countries, they seem to be scoring very well in terms of their social welfare system, and they have very high social expenditures, and also correspondingly very, very high tax burdens. And yet, when you look at global competitiveness indices produced by public bodies like the World Economic Forum and others, you will find that they're faring quite well. So the question is, how can that be that high tax rates, high social welfare spending, and yet these economies seem to be faring very well? I think one of the explanations is that a lot of the social spending is spurring economic activity. For instance, a lot of childcare facilities that they have created, which would allow a very high female participation in the economy. I think that's something we can learn from in Korea, where the female participation is increasingly difficult because not everybody has a mother-in-law or a mother or an ajumma at hand to take care of children. But I think the female population has a very high desire to participate in the economy, but the absence of sufficient daycare centers in Korea is hindering a higher female participation. And I think for Korea that is going through the same experience like Japan and Germany in terms of demographic development. I think needs to pay attention to this, providing sufficient support for childcare. Now, I think the European experience we can only put into place systems that we can afford to have. And the sources of payment can either be by raising taxes, or by raising public debt, or by raising the contributions from the population, be it through co-payments or otherwise, or by limiting the benefits to those who really have a need for it. And I think it's the latter that I think it needs, certainly for the German experience, as we emphasize, which is, provide welfare to those who are in dire need. But you don't need to pay school meals to kids from rich parents, and you don't have to pay tuition fees to kids of rich parents. So I think there needs to be a social dimension here, one that really looks after those sectors of society that are in real need. And with that, I would like to conclude, because I think I've already exceeded my limits in what to extend.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing with us the German experience. Really enlightening to hear that in Germany, child care program seems to be very much synergistic to encourage this socially productive wider female participation. With Dr. Limon, so you've been serving as main designer for Korea's data macro as well as the microeconomic policy of the leading KPI. So could you share with us what is your view? Korea is critical at the crossroad, and Korea, in a sense, for the first time, we are talking about in a fullest context, the notion of the welfare statism. We've been driving to growth first, and what the per capita income level, 23,000, and what sort of lesson you can learn, and what would you like to recommend as especially for political parties for that? Okay, maybe 6 or 7 minutes, please.
Often referred to, currently the Eurozone crisis is often referred to as European fiscal crisis. And I think it's a mistake to refer to the Eurozone crisis as fiscal crisis, because then the chain of logic is that there must be something wrong with the public finance of the Eurozone countries. And then that will easily then translate into an attack on the welfare state. But if you actually look at the mechanism of the Eurozone crisis, it has much more to do with the misdesigned currency union rather than the fiscal situation. In fact, other than Greece, the gypsy countries, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Italy were held up as examples of fiscal improvement and fiscal rectitude prior to the global financial crisis of 2008. So I think we need to be very careful about drawing lessons from the welfare state experience of Europe when we talk about what Korea needs to do. In fact, if we go back in history after the Great Depression and World War II, the welfare state model in the United States and Western Europe, based on social democracy, opened an era of unprecedented prosperity. In fact, annual productivity growth averaged about 3% from 1948 to 1973, and it led to a creation of a very solid middle class and broad-based development and growth. And it's often referred to as Great Compression, because not only was growth healthy, but income disparity narrowed in that period. But there were three things that happened that surfaced that became increasingly problematic. One has to do with political economy. Second fact has to do with trade, and third fact has to do with skill bias technical change. Let me address each one of them. As the golden era of growth took place in Western Europe and the United States, and close to full employment took place in those countries, the hand of the labor unions and others were very much strengthened. And as Michael referred to, there came some rigid practices in terms of labor market practices and so on. And in fact, that's so. in fact, the success of the post-war welfare state sowed the seeds of its own demise. And in countries like the UK and the United States, conservative politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan took advantage of that situation and appealed to the rhetoric of individual liberty and free enterprise, and also took advantage of not so respectable sentiment like racism to try and bring the conservatives back in power. Now, in more continental European countries like Germany, Nordic countries, and so on, the pushback against the welfare state was not as strong. Political economy-wise, they were much more keen on social democracy. But at the same time, they were not free from the influence of trade, as countries with lower levels of income were increasingly integrated into the global market, and also still by a technical change. So as Michael referred to, in Germany there was reform under Schroeder, sometimes referred to as hard reform. Britain had the third way, Anthony Giddens and so on. Denmark had flex security and so on. And basically the point was that they were trying to respond, the welfare state was trying to respond to the challenges of trade and still by a technical change based on active labor market policy and tripartite negotiation. Some countries are more successful than others, but as Michael mentioned with regard to Nordic countries and Germany, many countries did quite well with this reform and managed to save essential features of the welfare state. So I don't think it's really healthy to dismiss the welfare state and say the Eurozone crisis was due to defects in the European welfare state system. And what kinds of lessons can Korea draw then? I think we need to avoid the false dichotomy between universal welfare and selective welfare first. The basic idea should be that if something is deemed an essential service in a modern society, its coverage should be universal. But the beneficiary's payment for such a service should be commensurate with his or her income. So, based on that principle, if something like provision of water is deemed an essential service, then the coverage should be universal. But you don't have to provide water free of charge to everyone, right? Because presumably most people can afford the cost of water service. Now there are some exceptional cases, such as school lunch, because I think if we can somehow hide the identity of young students, young kids, who benefit from free lunches, right, so that they won't feel bad about having to rely on welfare payments, then we can apply the same principle. But it may be very difficult in designing such a system without hurting kids from poor families. So under some circumstances, we may have to adopt universal coverage as well as universal co-payment or universal payment by the state. But on the whole, I think the key thing to remember is universal coverage and payment based on the income level of beneficiaries. Now, as far as Korea's situation is concerned, Korea has an unusually low level of total tax revenue and social expenditure compared to OECD averages. In fact, we have about 27% of GDP as our tax revenue plus social security contributions, and only about 10% of GDP as our social expenditure. The averages for OECD countries for tax revenue and social security contributions is 34% of GDP and 19% for social expenditure. So there's a lot of room, average-wise, for us to spend. In fact, our expenditure as percentage of GDP on social services is lower than such countries as the Czech Republic, Portugal, Slovakia, Poland, all with countries with lower per capita income levels than Korea. So I don't agree that we cannot afford to spend more on social expenditure. But as Michael mentioned, we need to be very careful about how to keep that system sustainable. And one thing we need to do, as was mentioned, was to try and avoid pay-as-you-go system and rather define the contributions and what kinds of benefits you will receive based on those contributions, and link them too, so that it wouldn't be such a big burden on future generations. And at the same time, on the whole, I think it's useful to remember that the welfare state after World War II has really been the basis, the model basis for ensuring peace and prosperity in Western Europe and the United States, and we shouldn't forget that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lim. And I think this notion of the universal welfare program vis-a-vis the selective welfare program very clearly, I think, defined and removed some blurry demarcation line between two concepts, selective application of the universal welfare programs. Okay, and he presented different views on the Eurozone the crisis, and because of the Eurozone crisis, the concept of welfare state should not be excluded when designing policy formulation. Now, Mr. India, right, once we adopted the import substitution policy many years before a massive opening of the economy toward upward-oriented policy. And so, would you like to share, the lesson from the Western and the Nordic experience in terms of the Indian context? At this point, India is actively introducing universal welfare program, or starting off some selective basis in the social state. I mean, to come up with affordable welfare expenditure, economy should grow. So I'm wondering if where India at this point place more emphasis growth and the distribution of welfare programs.
Well, I think that the Indian context is somewhat different. First, let me begin by saying that we do regard Korea to be one of the remarkable economic success stories in the latter part of the 20th century. And therefore, we in India believe that Korea is a very shining example of success in adopting a model which has, to a large extent, been able to combine the virtues of distributional equity and what market efficiencies can do. And I totally agree with the first observations that in terms of the forthcoming dynamics of the Korean election, which is 6 months from now, Korea must be careful in perhaps not announcing populist measures which will upset the sound macroeconomic foundations of Korean economic growth by accepting the tilt on the side of the equity which will destroy the foundations of growth. But it is of course entirely for the Korean people to decide what kind of a delicate balance. I also agree with some of the observations made that there are perhaps no fixed paradigms in this matter. We all learned, when I was learning economics at the university and later teaching economics, we all had welfare economics as a very dominant part of our literature. And the welfare economics then faded out from the domain of mainstream economic literature. It has resurfaced again in different shapes and forms. Welfare economics in the traditional sense in India is still comparatively unknown. But I feel that what is more well known is inclusive growth, and based really on the recent report of the Growth Commission of the World Bank, with which I was somewhat associated, which described really what is important in the long run is not only the pace but the pattern of growth. and therefore both the pace and the pattern of growth needs to be really carefully orchestrated to get the more optimum result. Shivan, you have asked me some specific questions in the Indian context, and I'm happy to very quickly share our experience. First and foremost, India, when gained independence in 1947, more or less embraced a model of Fabian socialism with excessive state regulation. This resulted in the Indian economy growing at about 3.5 to 4% for the first 30 years of our post-independence in 1980. From 1980, we began somewhat a process of economic liberalization, which notched up our rate of growth to about 4.5% or so. But given the successive crisis, given low productivity, we were really somewhat intuitively embraced the principles of market liberalization in 1991. And after that, I think that the last 20 years has seen India becoming the second fastest growing economy. The last 4 years, excepting for this year, both on account of exogenous and endogenous circumstances, have resulted in somewhat lower rates of growth. But we have grown at about 8.5 to 8.9% for the last 5 years, which made us the second largest economy, considering the size of our population at being somewhat over 1.1 billion to be around 1.15 billion to become the world's largest population at current rates by 2015. Considering that out of 1.1 billion people, by 2015, 750 million Indians would be in the working age group. Therefore, the age dependency ratio really has come down because the working population has increased. Now, I think there is a very robust debate, Jim, on the rights and obligations of states. What is the right of the citizen and what are the obligations of the state? For instance, is it the right and the obligation of the state to provide free education and compulsory education to all, provide employment benefits to all, provide food benefits to all, provide clean drinking water to all, to provide shelter, and to really ensure a minimum quality of life? Now, this is a very raging debate right now in India. Being a member of Indian Parliament, I find that in the last 5 years, there has been a tectonic shift of merely entitlement to making them legally binding. So we enacted 5 years ago a new law called the Right to Employment Act, which guarantees employment to everybody. 100 days of wages ensure everybody who would like to seek that benefit at a wage rate which is indexed to inflation. This was adopted 5 years ago. 2 years ago, the Parliament adopted another far-reaching legislation called the Right to Free and Compulsory Education. That is, it is compulsory for every child from the age of 6 to 14 to receive free and compulsory education. And the midday meal program is a very, very robust program which is adopted throughout India to have a midday meal scheme. Parliament is currently debating a third legislation called the Food Security Act, which makes it necessary and obligatory for citizens to get food at a particular price. And of course the big debate is on that should it be universal or should it be selective. Now the answer which we have found, and it may not be a perfect answer, is that whereas the rights are universal, there is differentiation in the levels of access, and there is a raging debate on what is the best way to administer this particular program. For instance, should you actually give food to those who are below the poverty line on the same rates at which you give the food to people who are above the poverty line? Should there be a differentiation? We have opted for a differentiation. And more than anything else, the current debate is, should you really transport the food in such large quantity, or should you do what some other countries have done in terms of conditional cash transfers? We are moving towards a scheme of trying conditional cash transfers. We have a massive program by terms of giving a unique identification number, and then once he has been locked into that unique identification number, then automatic transfer of the cash equivalent of that amount directly to the beneficiary's account, and thereby give him the option of whether he wishes to spend for food or whether he wishes to spend for education. These are thoughts on which the jury is still out. We have not been able to really arrive at a satisfactory conclusion on universal, yes, how universal, differentiated, how differentiated, what should be the manner and mode of transferring this amount of subsidy to a government program or to a cash transfer program which will be able to do so. But the truth remains that India, having pursued a set of economic policies which give us very rapid economic growth, has really resulted in serious macroeconomic imbalances. Our fiscal deficit is far too high, our current account deficit is far too high, our subsidy bills are very high, and the subsidies, I might like to mention one more subsidy, namely petrol, diesel, kerosene, and cooking gas, which we import. 80% of India's requirement of these are really imported subsidies. And currently, the petroleum companies are being subsidized by the state in order to give to consumers subsidized petroleum prices. So I think that the jury is out on the issue of how to restore macroeconomic balances, because otherwise we will have difficulty climbing up to a growth rate of 8.5 to 9%. This is the first year of our 12th five-year plan, Mr. Chairman. This is also China's first year of 12th five-year plan. Both of us are embarked on the 12th five-year plan, but we wish to achieve a 9% rate of growth in which we combine high rates of economic growth coupled with some of these social security measures, some of which are not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, and sharing with us various legislation with respect to welfare programs and also recent transition toward more balanced right now. Dr. Song, before the China's open door policy, I guess China was making most egalitarian society, right? People get income basically the same, and everybody, although the income level was very low, not really differentiated in terms of the having, goods and commodities. But since the open door policy and China now really the most fastest growing economy in the world, but is showing a tremendous dichotomy, say coastal regions versus hinterland and rural urban and so on. I guess Chinese government might this time address the issues given these ongoing income polarization and regional dichotomy, so on and so on. So, in this context, would you like to share how Chinese government now look at these welfare issues at this critical point for China's development? What sort of the lessons China is learning from Western and Nordic countries' experience?
Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to share some of the Chinese experience about the social security systems and also some of the Chinese views on social security systems. You mentioned in the past, China is a socialist country, and the governments of the economies, especially of the capitalist economy. Actually, China provide a very quite good social security for the older people, for example, for the healthcare, and also people, even for the contract people, can enjoy some benefit. Even this health care is not high quality. And in terms of education, all the kids can go to school, which is free for the 9 years education. And but there is a lot of changes after the reform and open up to the outside world. China transformed from the socialist countries to the market economy. And because of this transition, actually it's the traditional socialist social security systems collapsed. And now in the last 10 years, this is a new initiative for the government to rebuild the new social security systems. At this time, it's not the socialism. It's based on the market economy. It's a market mechanism. And just as the theme of this topic. And I think China want to learn much from other countries, especially from Korea. And your countries want to do something already in the past and also want to upgrade. And now in China, actually, not only for the urban systems for futures, we already have some social security system also, but also for the countryside. So mainly the focus is now is for the farmers for the countryside systems in China. Our method of China's view is that it's universal coverage. All the citizens in the countryside is coverage as national social security system, not only for the pension systems, but also for the healthcare and also for education. But gradually, from the law point, we can provide some basic support for the education, for the pensions, and also for the healthcare for the countryside people. And then gradually we can increase the money to transfer to those people. I think in the last 5 years, already the money transfer to the countryside people is more than double. Each year we increase this money transfer. But also the key thing is that it's the systems and the basic ideas are most important. This is what the China has done. I don't think China's social security system is mainly focused on the income and even distributions now in China for the regional, from coastal regions and the west and the new channels, and also for some of the urban and for the countryside. I think that this is especially for the developed countries like China is a natural thing, because when developing countries at the early stage of economic development, usually a lot of people because they can become owner of a growth or can get high paid jobs in the big firms. They have good incomes. But for the farmers, especially for China, for the farmers want to find temporary jobs in the urban cities, in the urban regions. It is difficult for those people to have same incomes compared with high-paid employees in the big firms. But already this case already improved for them, because if they stay in countryside, they cannot get such case compared with they get temporary jobs in cities. So I think in the long run, China can improve these systems based on the economic development. This is very important. And countries' experience can be shared with China, or China can share other countries. I think the key issues for social security systems buildings is the money and also the people you want to support. The money is most important is the tax basis. It's based on how strong of your economy, especially for the developing countries, the industries and the firms. If you have very strong industry and firms, you can't get enough taxes and also revenues to support those people. This is one thing. Another one is for the how many the people you want to stop. And so only for this project, income distribution system is very important, because if we have the actual income distributions, you can build for people, and also you have a lot of consumers can support your industries. So if you have strong industries, you can have a good tax basis on your system. So I think for China, and I don't think China can have a very high quality social security system like other industry countries in the next few years. But based on our economic growth, we can improve in the future gradually.
Thank you very much, Dr. Song. Now, gentlemen, let me throw out, second interesting question. Well, I know that time takes away so quickly. We have we have left only in less than 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So let me pick up. To me, one of the most important issues we face at this point in Korea. As you know, the Korea's large conglomerate, what we call the chaebol, it can control the large enterprises in Korea, like the Samsung and so forth. So they really have taken a very, very critical role in moving Korea's compressed economic transformation as well as improvement. And the relative size in terms of economic strength, if you look at sharing of chaebol's total output out of the national output, it's getting larger and larger. And but these days, one of the popular sort of policy description is related to Korean chaebol is really heavily taxed, and coming up with some chaebol tax idea similar to Buffett tax, and so that we can increase the government revenue, which could be utilized for social welfare expenditure. Well, on one hand, if we really press chaebol, and Korea might lose its own growth dimension. But on the other hand, sometimes chaebol should be like this, entering such areas as mom and pop stores in which they can make profit. So the big question is that how Korean chaebol should play this conventional role, to what extent they need to be disciplined, and how are we going to handle this chaebol issues in terms of this taxation and growth dynamism. Well, Mr. Halbeck, you've been here in Korea many years, and please share your view on these political issues. A lot of these political parties now, looking at the chaebol issues really a great extent, serious in the eyes of politics. Maybe some of the
Sure. Thank you for that question. I love that topic. But first of all, I think we should be careful not to kill the goose that lays the royal eggs. So I think just taxing successful businesses disproportionately, it doesn't sound really appealing to me. I think the issues around chaebol today are quite different from let's say 20 years ago or 15 years ago. I think if you can look at chaebol, the two things that I think require more discipline with chaebol is, first of good for shareholders who would want to actually exercise their shareholder rights, to properly exercise them, if all shareholder meetings are clustered on 4 or 5 days in a year. I mean, that is very unique. I think that has to change. I think that is intolerable. So I think discipline in terms of governance needs to be restored. That's one. The second area I think where discipline is needed is, I think the Presidential Commission for Shared Growth is picking up on it, and that is in terms of the relationship between obviously very dominant shareholder companies on the one hand and their suppliers who are mostly medium-sized, small and medium-sized companies, to make sure that terms are not dictated. So this is more of a fair trade issue, and I think the Fair Trade Commission in Korea is doing actually a pretty good job in monitoring that and interfering and creating that discipline. So I think those are 2 areas where discipline needs to be restored. And I particularly on the first one, I feel very strongly that the governance of chaebol needs to change. I think we have seen a lot of progress in how chaebols have been managed, but that is one point that hasn't changed.
Very much. Dr. Lee, and how are we going to handle this issue?
Very easy question.
For the chaebol,
Yeah.
chaebol tax is actually an intercorporate dividend tax. What that is that back in the time of the Great Depression, FDR, President Roosevelt, introduced this to reduce the incentive on the part of the owners of business groups to travel disruptions, right? So it's not really, what it is that you tax dividends given to subsidiaries belonging to the same business group. So by taxing further on those dividends, right, you reduce the incentive to have a parent structure for the business group. That was the rationale, and try to flatten the parent structure business groups. That was the rationale for several tax. And we already have that actually in Korea, and I don't think it's a very effective means to raise revenue, and I don't think it's very effective to flatten the parent structure of the chaebol, because in order to tax dividends, you have to have dividends first, and if you just do some adjustments, it's very tough to. You may not have dividends to tax in the subsidiaries. So that's not a very effective means to deal with that with the chaebol problem. And as for chaebol's entry to mom and pop stores, I also disagree, because if you think about it, there are companies like Starbucks and Coffee Bean and so on that mushroomed over the past 2 decades or so, and as long as you don't have a blanket restriction on the entry of large companies into these areas, mom and pop stores are going to suffer. Right? So there's no real economic rationale for doing this, and it's more of a gossip story, given a lot of dollars of the chaebol families that are going into business, and they tend to set up sort of premium coffee shops and bakeries and so on. And I think it's pretty much a marginal issue. What is much more important is to strengthen investor protections and make it easier for shareholders to seek private remedies against tunneling, what is called tunneling, where basically profits from a subsidiary are tunneled or siphoned off to another subsidiary where the chaebol founders family has more of the controlling shares. So that kind of thing has to be prevented, and a legal recourse has to be put in place to prevent that. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to focus on marginal issues like mom and pop stores and so on. With regard to the relationship between chaebol and SMEs and innovative companies and so on, it would be important to enhance intellectual property protection and also strengthen competition and give SMEs with some technology outside options. If we look at the history of our Japanese small and medium-sized enterprises, once they have been able to escape from a very exclusive relationship with a particular Taibanese or Hitherto, they were able to deal on more even terms with our business groups. And I think it's much more important to give SMEs outside options as phone buyers contacting these SMEs or providing better intellectual property protection for what they've been able to develop technologically. And I think these are the real policy issues, not the market.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Singh, in India, we have Tata Group, Buffett Group. Yeah. Yes, and I think they've been cash cow for India's recent great economic performance. And how general public in India view those large conglomerate? Will this those large conglomerate to be more heavily taxed, scaled up for further investor expenditure? What is your view on this?
Well, in India, to be honest, there are, the Indian stock market index, which is called the top 10. The top 10 are some of these houses that you mentioned. The number one is Reliance, number two is Tata, the exchange position. But they are viewed as important drivers of growth. And I don't think that people are debating that they need to be subjected to some extra penalty by way of taxes. On the other hand, the debate which is available is whether the wealth of some of these are family run. Tata is a much widely dispersed company in terms of the structure of shareholding. Reliance is not a family controlled company. The issue is different. The issue is that people are pointing to increase in income inequality. The Indian Gini coefficient has deteriorated somewhat in the last 10 years. This has been a period of where India has achieved a very 8.5-9% rate of growth. So the issue is really, are really these companies, apart from adding wealth and value, and some very large external investments which are taking place are available, like Tata's purchase of the Jaguar company in the United Kingdom, Singapore steel company, with investments in the United States done by Reliance. The issue is one of how to mitigate the characteristics of growing deteriorating Gini coefficient. Second, I think that the emphasis is on credible regulatory leadership. The emphasis is not on differentiated tax characteristics, but how credible. For instance, we have a competition commission which is regulating that. We have a Securities Exchange Board managing the capital market to take care of the tunneling in a manner well good. We have the protection of the shareholder being done in particular. We have a very, very credible Securities Exchange Control Board of India, which is managing the control of capital issues. So the emphasis is really on credible regulation. The emphasis is on now shifted to adequacy of corporate social responsibility. So the new Indian Companies Act, which is coming, is making it obligatory for corporate social responsibility. The other thing, and I think I'll get into that as two very brief comments. One is that in India, public sector companies still play a very, very important role in certain key areas, particularly petroleum and natural gas, steel, pharmaceutical. So these public sector companies act as a kind of a check and balance to these large conglomerates which are there, and they will be subjected to the same kind of discipline to which we expect the private sector companies to be subjected to. And I think that the last point which I want to comment on is, this debate on the mom and pop shops being displaced. In the Indian context, this debate is more in the case of foreign retail companies like Walmart and so on turning up to knock out the mom and pop shop. Nobody is really they were initially bothered about Reliance and Tata taking up these retail stuff, but they soon realized that the employment displacement was nominal, and the mom and pop shops also existed, these shops also existed, these shops farmed out the supply chain to do that. But the debate is raging very terribly on whether you should allow companies like Walmart and so on, foreign retail multi-brand companies to turn up in India. I don't know what the scenario of Korea is.
To a lesser extent, we have similar problems. The foreign wholesale retailers are constrained to penetrate, the mom and pop store district
And I just want to ask you one question. How are you handling your demographic transition? Are you looking at huge opportunity of upgrading skills and moving to technology? Because I think that one of the big issues which will affect this area, particularly an economy like Japan, which has a very rapid aging population. China's population has been great, and therefore wage rates in China have gone up. And the great advantage the world has of an enormous amount of goods, services being available, very affordable cost. American savings rate is exceedingly low, Chinese savings rate is exceedingly high. The structural imbalances in the global economy, the product theory of the demographic imbalances, how are we handling that?
Yeah, okay, we're seeing but I think that is one of the most serious issues we face at this point, rapid aging population and the lowest birth rate. Someone who is taking it, children, also family, say 4 decades or so now, we have one. So I'm very much concerned about how we can increase the fertility rate. All right, if you have more time to like that, but let me invite this song. Of course, in China, you have a huge pool of the state-owned enterprises, and of course, China is trying to privatize many of those state-owned enterprises. How do you see that such huge state-owned enterprises cause sort of economic equality, and maybe general public has some strong sentiment of this. So sometimes we can see that some scandals erupting from state-owned enterprises, and international communities is also saying that the Chinese SOE is not really playing on the playing level, the principles. So would you like to share and how they play you see this welfare sort of the program?
I think this is a very big issue in China as well. Is international affairs as well. Actually, it's 2 months ago, World Bank public report about the 2030s China. The main point of that is to reform the Chinese activities. It's the main point. And I don't think this a lot of Chinese people, especially some Chinese scholars, all agree with this point. And China is now a transition economy. It's not finished transition from socialism economy to market one. It's already and also still under the transition period. So I think this is a very important role. I think this is similar with other developing countries. When we catch up, the big ones is much more important. So I very short. I don't think it's a very good idea to target very successful firms for the developed countries for the taxing to survive your social security system. This is not a good for China. I think we didn't have some specific tax, for example, SOE tax. We do have some tax also for the SOEs, because SOEs are owned by the state or the public. We get the dividend. So this dividend can contribute to the other things. One of them is social security dividend.
Thank you very much. Given limited time, and let me ask some final questions, and I'd like to extend a little bit maybe additional things because we extend schedule at the beginning. Okay, we noted that this the delivery system of the Latin America proved to be has very inefficient. And when we think of this private delivery system to say corporate social responsibility. I know that this Robert Lucas he pointed out that on his famous article on the mechanics of economic development, he really emphasized that on the job training and human capital formation, Korea succeeded in that school. That's why Korea's per capita income has been more than 10 times that of Filipino, or the Filipino per capita income was about 5 times higher in the early 1960s. But 30 years later, the picture was totally reversed, and Korea's per capita income was higher than 10 times Filipino per capita. He pointed out that on-the-job training within a company and the human capital formation is the critical factor to explain why a difference in the development between two countries. So my question is that, say, Korea's large conglomerate and even upper scale of the medium-sized firms, if they concentrate on the training and providing various donations to universities and school systems, this is one way of this carrying out the corporate social responsibility, so that the whole country can design a welfare plus growth mechanism complementary. This is like small talk. So I would like to hear your view on this corporate social responsibility vis-a-vis this welfare program.
Firstly, I think that corporate social responsibility by nature should be voluntary. The moment that it becomes imposed by a government on a corporation, then it rather has the character of a tax or a duty. I don't have any problem with government increasing taxes and introducing a CSR tax or increasing the corporate income tax by 2% to fund CSR activities, but I think we need to differentiate this by measures imposed by government for which the company will get no credit from the public. Banks are currently receiving a lot of instructions to fund all sorts of initiatives. I don't think we banks get any credit for it because it's mandated by the government. So it's more obligatory and therefore it has the character of a duty. I think CSR should be voluntary, and I think to avoid that there are free riders, I think as an advertisement. And if you incentivize that, and if you create a system where through a CSR index, through publicity, through awards, rewards, kind of systems that reward such behavior, I think that's where the government can play a good role in rewarding good behavior and use the shame and name and shame type of policy to publicize those who are doing nothing. But if you make it mandatory, then you might as well just introduce a tax, collect it, and do with it whatever you want to do.
All right, Dr. Lin, I'm proposing sort of the concept of the private delivery of welfare measures can be done. So would you like to share on this view?
On the whole, I agree with Michael, and I like to quote Milton Friedman. He once said, business of business is business. So what firms should do is business, not social responsibility. And I think it's better not to mix up social objectives with corporate objectives, unless firms themselves find it in their interest to do so, in terms of branding and attracting consumers and so on. And I think it's really nonsense to, on the one hand, lower the corporate income tax and then turn around and ask or impose or force corporate firms to do more for social responsibility. If you want to do that, then maintain the corporate income tax as before, and through a democratic process try and figure out what social objectives are important to fulfill and perform those or meet those objectives. I think that's the basic way to look at it. Now, but at the same time, in terms of delivery, if we could improve the efficiency aspect, the effectiveness aspect of delivery, and I think a lot of countries have experimented with the financing of services on the one hand, public financing of services on the one hand, and private delivery of services on the other. But and the logic was that for many social services, it would be very difficult to finance them directly out of the consumers themselves. So there has to be a public subsidy, and the government has to step in. But it's not necessarily the case that the government or public institutions directly deliver those services to people. That was the logic, and based on that logic, people promoted vouchers, and then there will be the consumers will have the vouchers provided by the government out of taxpayers' money, and then they will have a choice to make among various providers, private sector providers to deliver the services. But in practice, I think it's much more complicated than that. In fact, in Korea, as far as childcare is concerned, a lot of mothers, most mothers prefer public childcare centers as opposed to private childcare centers, and it has to do with the fact that for public childcare centers, there's at least a system of audit and supervision and quality control that's more reliable than very small scale private sector childcares. Now, for large scale private sector childcares, things are different. So I think we need to be very careful about how to get the mix right for the delivery side.
Thank you very much. Mr. Singh, the reason why I raised this question is that in Korea at this point there's huge popular demand for private sector, large conglomerates in the country. Like I said, it's all internal in the private care centers and the maternity leave and so on. So how do you see this notion? Talking about the Indian context, we already, by the way, have a name and shame. Every year, the Confederation of Indian Industry publishes the behavioral pattern, so to say, of companies and expenditures that they are carrying on corporate social responsibility. No political party, even the left political parties, have really at any stage talked of the CSR tax. That's not in the public domain. What is in public domain is that a new companies bill or a new companies act is currently under the consideration of Parliament, practicing consideration in my house, which is the upper house, the Senate. And there are two models. One is that name and shame be pursued, incentives and disincentives be created, and the other which is being debated is a certain percentage of their profits the companies should really incur that in terms of corporate social responsibility. It will be services provided by the private sector. It will not be the state sector. But what constitutes corporate social responsibility
and what are the ways in which we define corporate social responsibility. On that, I think there is a lack of clarity. So the companies should not be taxed, but they should be obliged out of their profits to incur a certain proportion of profit for activities related to corporate social responsibility, some of which is an area of uncertainty. And it is recognized that private delivery systems are infinitely superior compared to the inefficiencies of the state in terms of delivering those services. A school or a research institution, perhaps run by startups, is doing far better than its counterpart if it is to be run by the government. And I think that that is the current state of play. And the last question in terms of training is terrifically important to me. Upgrading of skills and vocational training. There the government has come up with an ambitious program of giving tax breaks and in fact giving subsidies to private sector for joining hands with various entities for different kinds of inculcation of training skills. In fact, I think in the last budget, it is government's intention to set up 3,500 training institutions by the private sector directly to either tax breaks or to a combination of state incentives. But I do believe that imposing a CSR tax, I entirely agree, is quite silly, because then of course you may as well raise the taxes instead of doing it in this particular. Now, whether you really want them that from their corporate profits they should earmark a certain proportion of it, and whether they should be voluntary or obligatory, on that there is still a claim on what to be best for.
Okay, Dr. So, you any idea to share from Chinese perspective on this? Yes. I think the government should provide this basic actually of the welfare, but not all of it. It's platforms and also employees can contribute actually support this system if we want to get more beyond the basic packaging of the benefits. So maybe here is what everybody should the boundaries of rights. If you contribute more, you can get more. But basically, you can get the basic package provided by the government.
All right, my dear colleagues, and I would like to give each of you just 1 minute to wrap up your final wisdom to satisfy the theme of this session. How we can embrace a upliftment of culture
I think number one message that I would like to convey is that Korea should be very cautious in making its choices and try to learn from the plentiful mistakes that other countries have made, so that we avoid falling into the same pitfall that other countries have fallen into. So I think Korea has the unique opportunity now to avoid making the same mistakes and study carefully different examples. That's number one message. Number two, on the last point on corporate social responsibility and about what the private sector can do, I much rather prefer a uniform system such as Senator Singers mentioned, that you say that okay, a certain portion of income has to be spent on CSR activities, but activities that the company can choose, can elect. And by making that mandatory for all companies, you have no free riders. So I like that part. What I don't like is government picking on the banking sector or any other specific sector that you guys should contribute more than others. As a bank, I feel that's not just, because why should we do more than, let's say, Samsung Electronics that earns more than the whole banking sector together? But I like the idea that there should be a mandatory portion of income set aside, but please let the companies choose how they spend it, and so that they can do it effectively for advertisement, branding the company, and do it for projects that they think are beneficial.
Thank you. And Dr. Lee?
Final wisdom, can you come in?
One issue we can address is the traffic challenge on this topic, so I'll address it. Korea is now the fourth youngest country in the OECD zone, and it will become the second oldest after Japan in 2050 in the OECD zone. And what we need to do, I believe, is wholesale change in labor market practices. For instance, currently our wage system is based on seniority for the most part, and what that does is to push older people out of work at a relatively tender age, 50 or so. And by making seniority-based system weaker and making productivity be the main determinant of wage payment, I think we can actually retain workers longer and also deal with serious problem like large share of self-employment in Korea's labor market, and we need to also lengthen retirement age and so on. On the global front, going back to Minister Singh's point, if we take a long view, there are only two regions in the world that will experience increase in working age population in 2050, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And I think it's imperative that the world as a whole find ways to engage in development cooperation, especially with those two regions, so that these two regions that experience a healthy increase in working age population will not fall into despair, but rather play a similar role as East Asia did over the past half century.
Thank you. And Steve?
Yes, I think that the 1 minute that Chairman would like to, I think that Korea first must maintain its fundamental macroeconomic stability as an example of the 21st century growth story. The world looks to Korea for the growth story, and do not allow transitional debate to derail Korea from its long-term growth strategy. Remember that you cannot have equity without growth. Of course, growth in itself is not a guarantee to equity. You must correct the distortions of the market, but do not introduce distortions of governance. So I think that in terms of the overall matrix, I think that a fine balance needs to be struck, but do not allow current transitional debates in Europe and transitional debates in the United States to derail Korea's long-term robust growth story, because their problems are different than the Korean problems. Korea must learn the right lessons and not emulate bad examples.
Thank you very much.
Just a quick point. First one is for Korea to come and not be ambitious in terms of building the social systems. I don't think government can provide everything for everyone in any time. Government just like something like a bridge to try some money and to transfer to poor people and need it. No God, I don't have anything to provide to everyone. The second point is that no free lunch with market economy. If you want to get more, you must contribute. This also for the work cities building.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after hearing the views from our distinguished panelists, I think we should print out all the transcript of what we discussed and must deliver to the party chairman and the leaders of the political party, government, as well as opposition, and the ministers of the Korean government. I hope Mr. Singh, you have the chance to address the Korean Assembly.
Well, I'll be honored for me to address the institute. Yes, because I doing so in other parts of the world. I go to Stanford and Harvard every year, and I believe the privilege to do that.
Well, I think I personally enjoyed very much presiding this session, and well, I wish we could have more time so that we can touch upon things in depth. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking a great contribution done by our distinguished panelists.